Hey guys, tonight we begin with the Vikings, who believed dying in battle was a professional achievement. And yet, there was one tribe that made Vikings quietly reconsider their plans. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Vikings were not supposed to feel fear. At least, not in public, not in writing, and definitely not in front of anyone holding an axe. Their entire culture ran on the assumption that hesitation was a personal flaw, and bravery was a basic life skill, like rowing or not screaming during surgery. From childhood, Vikings were raised on stories where heroes sailed into storms that looked actively hostile, fought enemies twice their size, and died smiling, which, according to Viking standards, was excellent customer service to the gods. Fear was something monks experienced while watching their monastery burn. Vikings experienced mild concern, followed by violence. The Norse worldview was beautifully simple. If something scared you, you attacked it. If you died, that was fine, because dying dramatically unlocked Valhalla and came with eternal bragging rights. Dying peacefully in bed, on the other hand, was the Viking equivalent of a career-ending embarrassment. You didn't want your gravestone to read, "He lived bravely and then caught a chill." This cultural confidence shows up everywhere in the sources. Vikings mocked kings, insulted entire armies, and treated fortified cities like mildly inconvenient speed bumps. Even defeat was rarely admitted honestly. Losses were blamed on bad luck, trickery, or someone else not following the plan properly. Fear never made the list. Which is why it gets interesting when the tone suddenly changes. Because in a few rare places, the sagas stop boasting. The language becomes vague. Locations are mentioned briefly and then avoided, like someone accidentally bringing up an awkward family secret at dinner. No dramatic speeches. No heroic last stands. Just silence. And silence, in a Viking story, is screaming. These were people who raided across continents, fought armoured knights with axes and confidence, and believed fate was fixed, so worrying about consequences was a waste of time. Fear served no purpose. You could not dodge destiny, so you might as well meet it swinging. Yet there was one group whose lands Vikings rarely raided, whose warriors they did not eagerly challenge, and whose reputation spread without the usual Viking exaggeration. No boasts, no tall tales, just careful distance. The fear was not loud. It did not shout. It did not sing. It quietly adjusted the route of the ship. Because when a culture that treats death like a networking opportunity starts hesitating, something has gone terribly, embarrassingly wrong. And whatever frightened the Vikings did not do so with swords. It did it by making them uncomfortable. If the Vikings were afraid of fighting, they would have stayed home. They did not stay home. They built ships, sharpened axes, and sailed directly toward people who very clearly did not want visitors. Fighting was not a problem. Fighting was the plan. Vikings were comfortable with violence because violence made sense. You could see an enemy. You could count them. You could estimate whether this fight was worth the trouble or merely going to ruin your day. Even when things went badly, at least the rules were familiar. Someone swung. Someone blocked. Someone probably died loudly. What the Vikings did not like was unpredictability, and this fear had nothing to do with losing a fair fight. They were not afraid of warriors. They were afraid of situations where their usual advantages evaporated, where strength, numbers and enthusiasm stopped working, where the world itself seemed uninterested in cooperating. The Vikings expected battles to be loud, shields clashing, men shouting, drums beating. If nothing was happening, that was unsettling. Silence was not normal. Silence meant something was watching. And then there were the fights that never really started. Imagine landing in unfamiliar territory, marching inland, and feeling watched without ever seeing anyone. No scouts, no obvious enemies, no villages to raid, just forest, snow, tracks that vanish as quickly as they appear, arrows that arrive without introduction and depart before you can complain about them. That kind of conflict was deeply irritating to a Viking. They preferred enemies who stood still long enough to be hit. They respected strength, but they understood it. This was rude. This was cheating. This felt less like warfare and more like being slowly bullied by geography. Viking weapons were heavy. Armour was heavy. Shields were heavy. And all of it worked beautifully on open ground. But when movement slowed, when visibility disappeared, and when sound behaved strangely, all that equipment became less impressive and more exhausting. Suddenly, the fearless warrior was sweating, disoriented, and deeply suspicious of every tree. This fear was not cowardice. It was frustration mixed with a dawning realization that brute force was no longer solving the problem. And Vikings hated problems that could not be punched into submission. They did not fear dying in battle. They feared wasting effort on battles that refused to happen. So when Vikings began to avoid certain lands, it was not because they were weak. It was because those lands refused to fight them properly, and that was unacceptable. Vikings were excellent travellers, but even they believed the world had edges. Not literal cliffs where ships fell into nothingness, although that would have been on brand, but psychological edges. Places where maps became vague, directions turned into guesses, and confidence quietly packed its bags and left. Beyond those edges lived the Sami. From a Viking perspective, the Sami were not merely far away, they were inconveniently placed. Their lands stretched across forests so dense they swallowed sound, across tundra where the ground looked solid until it betrayed you, and across snowfields where every direction looked exactly the same. Vikings liked coastlines. They liked rivers. They liked places where a ship could wait patiently while its crew caused problems inland. Samiland offered none of that. The Norse sagas mention these regions carefully, often without detail, like someone referencing a distant relative they hope never visits. The language is vague. The descriptions are minimal. This is not because the Vikings lacked curiosity. It is because curiosity had limits, and those limits froze solid somewhere north of comfort. The Sami did not live in towns that could be surrounded or burned. They did not farm fields that could be stolen. They did not build fortifications that could be admired before being destroyed. They moved. Constantly. Quietly. With the unsettling confidence of people who knew exactly where they were while everyone else did not. To a Viking, this was infuriating. Raiding depended on targets. Fixed targets. Preferably with storage buildings, livestock, and a general sense of panic. The Sami had none of this. You could march all day and find nothing but snow, trees, and the growing suspicion that you were the problem. Even trade expeditions treated the region differently. Vikings travelled carefully, respectfully, and usually with guides. They did not arrive announcing themselves. They did not linger longer than necessary. And they absolutely did not wander off alone, which for a Viking was already a sign something was deeply wrong. The Sami seemed to exist outside normal rules. They survived where Vikings struggled. They navigated terrain without landmarks. They appeared and disappeared without explanation. It was as if the land recognized them and actively rejected everyone else. And that is what truly unsettled the Norse. They were not afraid of people living beyond the map. They were afraid of people who made the map meaningless. Because once the map stops working, strength means very little. And Vikings knew it. Vikings liked enemies they could blame. A rival clan, a stubborn king, a monk who looked at them wrong. What they did not like was an enemy that could not be stabbed, shouted at, or dramatically defeated in single combat. Sami territory had that problem. The land itself seemed to resent visitors. Forests were dense enough to muffle sound, turning shouted orders into awkward whispers that went nowhere. Snow absorbed noise like a conspiracy. You could be marching with a group of heavily armed warriors and still feel uncomfortably alone, which is not the emotional state you want before a fight. Then there was the cold. Vikings respected cold. They lived with it. But this was a different category entirely. This was cold that punished mistakes instantly. Step wrong, and your foot sank into snow deeper than expected. Move too fast and you sweated, which then froze, which then became a personal betrayal by your own clothing. Viking armour, usually a symbol of strength, became a liability. Heavy gear slowed movement. Shields bumped into trees. Spears caught branches. Axes were suddenly less useful when every swing required space you did not have. The forest did not care how brave you were. It cared whether you fit between the trees. Navigation was worse. Landmarks vanished under snow. Tracks disappeared overnight. Even the sky refused to cooperate, remaining a flat, featureless grey that made direction feel like a suggestion rather than a rule. Vikings prided themselves on navigation at sea, but land navigation in this environment felt like being laughed at quietly by nature. Meanwhile, the Sami moved through this landscape as if it were indoors. They knew which snow would hold weight and which would swallow you. They knew how sound travelled, how wind shifted, how animals moved. To Vikings, this looked suspiciously like magic. To the land, it looked like competence. And that imbalance mattered. A Viking raid depended on momentum, speed, shock, fear. All of that evaporated the moment the environment refused to cooperate. Marching inland became slow. Camps became vulnerable. Fires became visible beacons in a world that otherwise concealed everything. Worst of all, the land never announced danger. There were no warning signs, no dramatic build-up, just the creeping realization that you were tired, lost, cold, and being observed by someone who was not having any of those problems. The land did not need to fight the Vikings. It simply removed their advantages and waited. And when the environment itself seems to be on the enemy's side, courage starts feeling a lot like poor planning. Vikings expected enemies to behave politely. By that, I mean they expected them to stand somewhere visible, preferably yelling, so everyone knew where the violence would begin. Even ambushes followed certain unspoken rules. Someone rushed out. Someone shouted. Someone made a mistake loudly. What Vikings did not expect was to be attacked by people who apparently did not wish to be seen at all. In Sami territory, fights did not start. They occurred. A man would be walking, thinking about absolutely nothing important, when suddenly he was not walking anymore. Arrows arrived without warning, without sound, and without the courtesy of revealing who fired them. One moment there was a group. The next moment there was confusion, shouting, and someone asking a very reasonable question like, "Where did that come from?" The answer was usually everywhere and nowhere. Sami hunters understood concealment at a level Vikings found deeply annoying. White clothing blended into snow. Movement was slow and deliberate. They used terrain like it was part of their body. Vikings, by contrast, wore darker clothing, carried metal, and made noise simply by existing. Stealth was not their strong suit. Subtlety made them itchy, and the attacks were never decisive in a dramatic sense. No glorious clash, no clear victory, just constant pressure. A man wounded here, a supply carrier disappearing there. Camps disturbed at night. Equipment sabotaged quietly, as if the land itself was misplacing things out of spite. This was not how Viking honor worked. Vikings believed in earning victory through confrontation. You fought, you won, you took spoils, and you left. This was attrition, psychological warfare, the kind of fighting that drained energy, patience, and morale rather than blood alone. Worst of all, there was no clear moment to fight back. Charging into the forest solved nothing. Shouting threats solved nothing. Swinging axes at trees, while emotionally satisfying, did not solve anything either. The Sami did not stand their ground because they did not need to. They chose when to appear and when to disappear. They let the Vikings exhaust themselves, wander, and grow paranoid. Every snapped branch became suspicious. Every shadow looked personal. Eventually, the Vikings did something unthinkable. They stopped advancing. Not because they were defeated, but because the enemy refused to be present long enough to defeat. And nothing unsettles a warrior culture faster than a fight that refuses to happen on schedule. To a modern mind, when Vikings accused someone of using magic, it sounds like poetic exaggeration, symbolism, metaphor, a dramatic way of saying this went badly. But to the Vikings, magic was not a figure of speech. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation for things that refused to behave properly. And the Sami, unfortunately for Viking peace of mind, did a lot of things that refused to behave properly. Norse sources repeatedly described the Sami as sorcerers, shapeshifters, weather makers, and curse throwers. Snowstorms appeared suddenly. Fog rolled in at exactly the wrong moment. Travellers became disoriented for no obvious reason and walked confidently in the wrong direction for hours. To Vikings, who already believed the world was thick with spirits, this did not feel like coincidence. This felt targeted. Sami shamans used drums, chants, and trance rituals that looked deeply unsettling to outsiders. They entered altered states, spoke to spirits, and claimed knowledge of places no one else could see. Vikings, who practiced their own magic through Seder, recognized power when they saw it. And recognizing power without understanding it is deeply uncomfortable. Even worse, this magic did not demand attention. It did not come with grand displays or obvious theatrics. It worked quietly, subtly, in ways that could not be challenged with a sword. You cannot stab fog. You cannot duel confusion. You cannot shout your way out of being lost. Weather magic terrified the Vikings most. The storm at sea was understandable. A storm inland, timed perfectly to ruin a march or extinguish a campfire, felt personal. The idea that someone might influence the sky itself was enough to make even confident warriors hesitate. And hesitation spreads. Once one man believes he is cursed, the others notice every misstep. Every stumble becomes suspicious. Every delay becomes ominous. The group starts interpreting bad luck as intentional hostility from unseen forces. This was not cowardice. It was logic, according to their worldview. The Sami did not need to kill many Vikings. They only needed the Vikings to believe they could kill them without ever appearing, and belief mattered more than reality. When an enemy can attack your body, you fight. When an enemy can attack your understanding of the world, you withdraw, because no amount of bravery helps if the universe itself seems to be against you. And from the Viking perspective, in Sami lands, it absolutely was. If the Vikings had merely believed the Sami were strange, that would have been manageable. Vikings dealt with strange all the time. What made the situation far worse was that their own mythology quietly agreed with them. Because according to Norse tradition, even Odin, the All-Father, god of war, wisdom, poetry, and questionable parenting, did not know everything. And some of what he learned from the North. Norse myths describe Odin travelling in disguise, seeking knowledge from outsiders, shamans, and beings who lived beyond the edges of ordinary society. In later interpretations and scholarly readings, these figures strongly resemble Sami shamans, masters of trance, vision, spirit travel, and hidden knowledge. The kind of people who did not sit on thrones or command armies, but still made kings uncomfortable. That detail mattered enormously. Odin was not a god who asked for help lightly. He sacrificed an eye for wisdom. He hung himself from a tree to learn the runes. He was willing to suffer, deceive, and wander endlessly if it meant gaining knowledge. So the idea that even he sought wisdom from northern shamans sent a very clear message to Viking listeners. If Odin needed their knowledge, then these people were not ordinary. And Vikings paid attention to what frightened their gods. The Sami practiced forms of spiritual power that Vikings recognized but did not fully control. Shamanic journeys, spirit animals, divination, weather knowledge. To the Norse, this was dangerously close to Seder, a form of magic already considered powerful, unsettling, and socially risky. Even Odin's practice of it was considered controversial. That alone should tell you how uncomfortable it made people. Vikings respected strength. They respected courage. They even respected clever enemies. But they feared power that could not be measured. The Sami did not rule lands. They did not command armies. They did not build monuments. And yet their influence seeped quietly into Norse cosmology itself, like a footnote that refuses to be ignored. This blurred line between myth and reality was deeply unsettling. It suggested that the Sami were not just another tribe, but a people existing halfway between worlds, human enough to trade with, dangerous enough to avoid, and mysterious enough to inspire gods. And when your god of war treats someone like a teacher rather than a target, you do not charge in yelling. You listen. You hesitate. And very quietly, you steer your ship somewhere else. Because if Odin approached them with caution, maybe you should too. One of the most unsettling things about the Sami, from a Viking point of view, was not what they did, but what they very deliberately did not do. They did not raid. They did not conquer. They did not arrive by ship, burn villages, take hostages, and then write poetry about it afterward. To Vikings, this was confusing behaviour, borderline suspicious. Because in the Viking worldview, land was meant to be taken, defended, and argued over loudly. If someone lived somewhere and did not want more land, that person was either lying or operating on a level you did not understand. The Sami did not build permanent towns that could be captured. They did not farm fields that could be seized. Their wealth moved with them. Herds, knowledge, roots, seasons. You could not burn what refused to stay still. You could not steal what disappeared into the forest before you finished your sentence. This made them impossible to intimidate. Vikings understood fear as something you imposed. You arrived unexpectedly. You made noise. You demonstrated violence. People panicked. People complied. That was the system. The Sami did not panic. They simply left, and then returned later when the Vikings were gone, confused, cold, and wondering why they had bothered. This lack of interest in conquest deeply unnerved Viking leaders. An enemy who wants your land can be fought. An enemy who does not want anything you have is much harder to negotiate with. There is no leverage, no threat, no prize big enough to justify the effort. The Sami were not impressed by Viking weapons, ships, or reputation. They had survived generations of brutal winters, famine, and isolation without help. A group of loud foreigners with axes did not register as an existential threat. At best, they were a temporary inconvenience. To Vikings, this felt like disrespect. And disrespect is far more irritating than hostility. Worse still, the Sami understood something the Vikings struggled with. Ownership of land is meaningless if the land does not cooperate. You cannot dominate a place that refuses to support you. You cannot rule snow, forests, or migrating animals with laws and borders. The Sami lived with the land. The Vikings tried to impose themselves on it, and that difference mattered, because nothing unsettles a conquering culture faster than meeting people who do not care about being conquered. Vikings were not unreasonable people. They understood the value of trade. In fact, they loved trade almost as much as they loved violence, which is saying something. And when it came to the Sami, trade was not just tolerated, it was carefully encouraged. Furs, hides, antlers, walrus ivory, and other northern resources flowed south through Sami networks. Vikings wanted those goods badly. They were valuable, portable, and made everyone involved feel very sophisticated. So trade happened, quietly, politely, with significantly fewer axes involved than usual. But here is the important part. Trade expeditions behaved very differently from raids. When Vikings went trading into Sami territory, they did not swagger. They did not show off. They did not shout their lineage at the top of their lungs. They travelled with guides. They followed rules. They offered gifts. They listened. This was not fear exactly. It was respect wrapped tightly around caution and sealed with self-preservation. Raiding, on the other hand, was rare. Extremely rare. And when Vikings did attempt it, the results were consistently disappointing. There were no great victories recorded. No triumphant sagas celebrating crushed Sami camps and heroic plunder. Just vague references to losses, failed journeys, and expeditions that returned early with fewer men and less confidence. Which, in Viking storytelling, is as close to an admission of failure as you get. The Sami were not defenseless traders waiting to be exploited. They controlled the routes. They knew where resources were. They knew which valleys trapped travellers and which rivers disappeared under ice. A trading Viking followed Sami knowledge. A raiding Viking ignored it. Guess which one survived longer? Even more unsettling was the fact that Sami traders did not behave like frightened victims. They negotiated calmly. They set terms. They refused deals that did not suit them. They walked away without concern. Vikings were used to intimidating their way into favourable outcomes. Here, intimidation did nothing. You cannot threaten people who do not depend on fixed property. This imbalance created an unspoken rule. Trade was acceptable. Violence was not worth the effort. And when a culture built on raiding decides something is not worth raiding, that decision comes from hard experience. The Vikings did not fear the Sami as enemies. They feared them as people who made raiding inefficient. And for a Viking, inefficiency was terrifying. Vikings liked terrain that cooperated. Coastlines, rivers, open fields where you could see what was trying to kill you and respond accordingly. Forests, on the other hand, were already suspicious. Northern forests were something else entirely. They did not merely exist, they participated. Once Vikings moved inland in Sami territory, everything they relied on stopped behaving properly. Ships became useless decorations sitting far away on the coast, doing nothing to help. Horses struggled. Supply lines stretched thin. Suddenly, the terrifying Norse warrior was just a man carrying too much metal in a place that deeply disliked metal. Armour, usually a symbol of strength, became an exhausting burden. Shields snagged branches. Spears hit trees instead of enemies. Axes required space that did not exist. Every step produced noise, and every noise felt like an announcement. Vikings were very good at being intimidating. They were not good at being quiet. The forest, however, was excellent at silence. Snow absorbed sound so completely that shouting felt pointless. Orders vanished into nothing. You could stand 10 steps away from another man and feel isolated. And isolation, in unfamiliar land, has a way of turning bravery into irritation, and irritation into panic. Meanwhile, the Sami moved through the forest as if it were a well-lit hallway. They knew which paths stayed firm underfoot and which turned into traps. They knew where animals moved, where wind shifted, where snow hid tracks. To Vikings, this did not look like skill. It looked like favoritism. It felt as though the forest had chosen a side. Campfires became dangerous. Smoke gave away position. Light carried farther than expected. Camps that felt secure one night felt exposed the next, and every morning brought new signs that someone had been nearby without leaving a proper introduction. A disturbed trail, missing equipment, footprints that appeared and vanished as if they were teasing. The forest never attacked directly. It did not need to. It slowed movement, drained energy, broke morale. It turned every plan into a suggestion rather than a rule. The longer Vikings stayed, the worse it got. At some point, even the most confident warrior begins to suspect that brute force is no longer the correct solution. And when a culture built on domination realizes the environment itself is uninterested in being dominated, the correct response is not rage, it is retreat. The Vikings did not lose battles in the forest. They lost momentum, and that was worse. Vikings did not need mass casualties to learn a lesson. They only needed stories. And stories, unfortunately for Viking confidence, travelled faster than ships ever could. A raid that failed quietly was far more dangerous than one that failed loudly. When warriors returned home without trophies, without songs, and without a clear explanation, people noticed. Vikings were excellent storytellers. They narrated everything: victories, defeats, insults, and even bad decisions. Silence, however, was suspicious. Men came back with fewer companions than they left with. They spoke vaguely about bad land, strange weather, and journeys that did not go well. They avoided details. They changed the subject. And nothing makes a room more uncomfortable than a Viking who refuses to brag. Around fires and in longhouses, the stories spread. Not dramatic sagas, but cautious warnings. Do not travel too far inland. Do not go without a guide. Do not camp there. Advice like that was rare in Viking culture. Normally the advice was, bring more axes. And then there were the missing men. No heroic deaths, no bodies returned, just absence. Absence is terrifying because it leaves space for imagination, and imagination is far more cruel than reality. A man who dies in battle is understandable. A man who vanishes invites every unpleasant theory at once. Rumours did the rest of the work. Some said the forest swallowed people. Others claimed the Sami could call storms or confuse minds. Some insisted spirits led travellers in circles until they collapsed from exhaustion. The exact details varied, but the conclusion was always the same. Something about that land was not worth testing. The stories were not told loudly. They were told carefully, quietly, with a seriousness that discouraged jokes, and when jokes stopped, fear had already won. Younger warriors listened closely. Leaders adjusted routes. Traders became more cautious. Maps were redrawn, not with ink, but with habit. Ships went elsewhere. Expeditions chose safer targets. No announcement was ever made. Vikings did not declare fear. They simply stopped going. This is how fear truly spreads, not through panic, but through habit, through choices that quietly shift, through roads no longer taken, through places that become someone else's problem. The Sami did not need armies to defend their land. They did not need walls or banners, they needed only reputation. And once a reputation settles in a warrior culture, it is nearly impossible to remove. Because you can defeat an enemy, but defeating a story is much harder. The Vikings never announced their fear. There was no proclamation, no council decree, no dramatic speech declaring, "We shall never go north again." That would have been humiliating. Vikings did not formalize fear. They practiced it silently. Instead, fear showed up in absence. Certain routes stopped being used. Certain hunting grounds became inconvenient. Certain journeys were postponed indefinitely, which is Viking for absolutely not. Maps were not erased, but they grew vague in those areas, filled with empty space where details should have been. And when asked about those regions, people answered with shrugs, short replies, or stories that ended abruptly. This quiet behaviour mattered. Vikings were not subtle people. They celebrated victories loudly and mourned losses dramatically. When something scared them, the absence of noise was the signal. Fear did not roar. It whispered, and everyone listened. No one bragged about venturing deep into Sami territory. No one claimed glory there. Young warriors were not encouraged to test themselves in those lands. Instead, elders recommended safer targets, closer coasts, easier prey, and elders, in Viking society, were not ignored lightly. These were men who had survived long enough to have opinions worth hearing. Even the sagas reflect this discomfort. The Sami appear briefly, strangely, and often without clear explanation. They are described with distance, as if naming them too directly might invite attention. Viking storytelling loved detail, insult, and exaggeration. The restraint here is noticeable. This is not how you write about enemies you feel confident defeating. Fear also shaped etiquette. When Vikings encountered Sami traders or guides, they behaved differently. Less shouting, more listening, more respect. The kind of respect that does not come from equality, but from uncertainty. You treat people carefully when you are not sure how much power they actually have. And so fear settled into routine. Ships sailed elsewhere. Expeditions turned back earlier. Borders remained undefined. No one needed to say anything out loud, because the behaviour said everything. The north remained quiet, not because it was empty, but because it was avoided. The Sami did not chase the Vikings away. They did not threaten them openly. They did not conquer anything. They simply remained where they were, unchanged, while Viking attention drifted elsewhere. And in a culture that defined itself through action, that quiet avoidance was the loudest admission possible. Fear does not always scream. Sometimes it just changes your plans. The Sami did not defeat the Vikings in any traditional sense. There was no decisive battle where shields shattered and songs were written afterward. No great Viking leader fell dramatically in the snow while shouting something poetic. That would have been easier to process. That would have fit the Viking worldview nicely. Instead, the Sami did something far more unsettling. They remained unreachable. They were not stronger in numbers. They did not possess superior weapons. They did not overwhelm Viking forces with brute strength. What they had was something Vikings struggled with deeply: the ability to exist beyond control. The Sami did not stand still long enough to be conquered. Their camps moved. Their wealth travelled with them. Their lives were organised around seasons, animals, and routes that only they fully understood. Vikings could not pin them down, surround them, or force them into the kind of conflict Vikings knew how to win. This was infuriating. Vikings liked problems with solutions. Build more ships, bring more men, hit harder. But how do you hit someone who is not there when you arrive? How do you intimidate people who simply vanish into terrain that actively dislikes you? Every Viking advantage dissolved the deeper they went inland. Heavy armour slowed them. Loud movement gave them away. Ships became irrelevant. Supply lines turned fragile. Meanwhile, the Sami lost none of their advantages. They moved faster, carried less, and relied on knowledge rather than force. From a Viking perspective, this felt unfair. And unfairness is often mistaken for danger. The Sami did not need to win battles. They needed to make Viking presence expensive, exhausting, and unrewarding. Over time, that strategy worked perfectly. Viking leaders began asking practical questions. What do we gain? What do we lose? Is this worth it? Those questions rarely ended in enthusiasm. The Sami were not an enemy you could defeat. They were an environment you had to endure. And Vikings already had enough trouble enduring the actual environment. So the Vikings did what any rational warrior culture does when faced with an opponent it cannot dominate. They disengaged. They chose easier targets, richer lands, softer coasts, places where victory came with loot and stories rather than frostbite and confusion. The Sami were not terrifying because they killed Vikings. They were terrifying because they could not be controlled. And for a culture built on domination, control mattered more than victory. For all the shouting, raiding, and enthusiastic axe swinging, Vikings were not stupid. Reckless, yes. Loud, absolutely. But stupid? No. They paid close attention to patterns, especially patterns that involved men not coming home. The Viking world prized courage, but it also respected experience. And experience had a way of quietly setting boundaries. Certain seas were avoided in winter. Certain coasts were only raided once. Certain rivers were approached carefully. And certain lands far to the north slowly earned a reputation that discouraged enthusiasm. This was not defeat. It was calculation. Viking leaders understood something important. Not every place was worth the effort. Raiding worked best when rewards were clear and resistance behaved predictably. Monasteries were perfect. Towns were excellent. Wealthy coasts were practically begging for it. Sami territory offered none of that. No cities, no hordes, no terrified populations waiting to be exploited. Just cold, forests, and people who refused to cooperate. Over time, Viking attention shifted elsewhere, not because they were driven out, but because they chose not to return. Routes were adjusted, targets were reconsidered. Expeditions were planned with a little more realism and a little less optimism. This was Viking pragmatism at work. They understood that bravery without reward was pointless. A warrior who died gloriously but achieved nothing useful was still dead. And dead men do not raid again. Leaders who repeatedly sent men into hostile land without profit did not stay leaders for very long. So the Vikings adapted. They respected limits even if they never admitted fear. The north became a place you traded with carefully, travelled through cautiously, and spoke about vaguely. No banners were planted, no victories declared. Just quiet acknowledgement that some places resisted domination without ever needing to fight directly. This recognition was deeply un-Viking, and that is precisely why it mattered. The Vikings did not believe they were invincible. They believed they were practical. When faced with something that refused to break, they moved on. They did not romanticize failure. They avoided it. And in doing so, they revealed something rarely discussed. The Vikings were not fearless because they lacked fear. They were fearless because they chose when fear was worth listening to, and in the case of the Sami, fear was telling them something very sensible. Stay away. In the end, the Sami did not terrify the Vikings by defeating them, slaughtering them, or humiliating them in glorious battle. That would have been easy to understand. That would have fit neatly into the Viking mental filing cabinet labelled, "Things we will fix with more axes." Instead, the Sami terrified the Vikings by refusing to be controlled. They did not play by Viking rules. They did not fight wars the Viking way. They did not build cities to conquer or fields to seize. They lived lightly, moved freely, and relied on knowledge rather than force. And in doing so, they quietly dismantled everything Vikings relied on to feel powerful. The Vikings were masters of domination. They believed the world could be shaped through strength, fear, and reputation. Most of the time they were right. But the Sami world resisted shaping. It absorbed violence without responding in predictable ways. It turned strength into exhaustion and confidence into irritation. That was terrifying. Fear for the Vikings was not about death. They expected death. They welcomed it, at least in theory. Fear was about uncertainty, about situations where effort did not guarantee results, about places where courage did not translate into control. The Sami represented all of that. They were not louder than the Vikings. They were not richer. They were not more aggressive. They were simply impossible to dominate. And that is why Viking interest faded. Not with rage, not with retreat, but with quiet avoidance. History often celebrates conquerors, but it forgets the power of endurance. The Sami did not need to defeat the Vikings. They only needed to outlast them. And they did. Their lands remained theirs. Their culture endured. Their way of life continued long after Viking raids turned elsewhere. So yes, the Vikings were feared across Europe. But they feared something too. They feared a people who could not be conquered. They feared a land that would not submit. They feared the uncomfortable truth that not every problem could be solved by force. And sometimes, the most powerful victory is simply refusing to lose. When the sun dipped behind Edo's rooftops, the city didn't wind down. It sharpened its appetite. The daytime world of shops, samurai processions, and orderly routines gave way to something louder, wetter, and far more fragrant. Paper lanterns bloomed along the streets like glowing fruit. Rain slicked the packed dirt roads, turning footsteps into soft splashes. And everywhere smoke rose. Not from hearths inside homes, but from dozens of small charcoal fires carried, pushed, or propped up by vendors who knew exactly when hunger struck hardest. This was the true beginning of Edo's night markets. Not grand plazas or formal bazaars, but narrow streets, bridge approaches, temple gates, and ferry landings where people naturally slowed down. Vendors appeared as if summoned by hunger itself. Some dragged wooden carts, others balanced shoulder poles with pots swinging gently at each end, steam trailing behind them like ghosts. The city became a moving kitchen, and the air thickened with the smell of soy sauce, fish fat, and burning charcoal. Eating here required no ceremony. You didn't sit, you didn't linger. You stood under the eaves, sleeves rolled, sandals soaked, chewing while rain tapped your hat. This was food designed for speed, warmth, and satisfaction. Perfect for labourers finishing a long shift, Messengers rushing across the city, travellers arriving after dark, and yes, even samurai who preferred not to be seen enjoying street food, but absolutely did so anyway. Money changed hands quickly. Copper coins clinked. A bowl was passed, slurped, and handed back. Chopsticks were wiped on sleeves. No one asked for seconds because another stall waited 10 steps away. Edo was enormous, crowded, and hungry, and these night vendors fed it one skewer and one bowl at a time. What mattered most was heat. Warm hands around a bowl, warm broth in the stomach, warm smoke in cold, damp air. The night markets were not about luxury or novelty. They were about survival made delicious. In a city where most people lived in cramped wooden homes with strict fire rules, street food wasn't a guilty pleasure. It was practical, safer, easier, and often better than cooking at home. As lanterns swayed and rain continued to fall, Edo's streets transformed into a ribbon of light and smell, and once the first fire was lit, everyone knew the night had truly begun. If Edo's night markets had a soundtrack, it wasn't music, it was a voice. A long, drawn-out call echoed down the streets, rising and falling like a chant. That sound meant only one thing. Soba was coming. Long before delivery apps or restaurant signs, dinner announced itself by shouting politely through the rain. Soba vendors were among the most mobile and recognizable figures of Edo's nights. They didn't wait for customers to find them. They went hunting. Balanced across a shoulder pole hung 2 wooden boxes, one holding bowls and noodles, the other a small charcoal stove with a pot of hot broth sloshing gently as the vendor walked. Every step sent steam into the air, carrying the scent of soy, dried fish, and warm buckwheat. Soba was fast, cheap, and filling, exactly what the city demanded. The noodles were thin and slightly coarse, boiled quickly and drowned in a simple broth made from soy sauce and fish stock. No garnish worth bragging about, no artistry, just speed. A customer stopped the vendor, coins were exchanged, and within moments a bowl was ready. You ate standing under an awning or beside a bridge railing, slurping loudly because that was practical, not rude. The appeal went beyond hunger. Soba was warm, and Edo nights were damp. Winters cut through thin robes, and even summer rain chilled the skin. A bowl of hot noodles wasn't comfort food in the emotional sense. It was survival food. Labourers ate it to keep going. Couriers ate it between routes. Travellers ate it because it was familiar, reliable, and unlikely to poison them. Soba also had a reputation. It was common food, but not shameful. Samurai, officially supposed to dine with restraint and dignity, were known to sneak bowls in alleyways, swords resting against walls while they slurped like everyone else. The broth didn't care about rank, and neither did the vendor. Everyone paid the same price. There was no seating, no privacy, and no lingering. When the bowl was empty, it went back to the box. The vendor wiped it quickly, hoisted the pole again, and moved on, calling into the dark for the next customer. The meal left no trace except warmth in the stomach and the fading echo of that familiar cry. In a city of nearly 1 million people, soba vendors stitched the night together. Their voices carried through rain and lantern light, turning hunger into something audible, and briefly, something satisfied. Among all the smells that drifted through Edo's night streets, none stopped people faster than eel. The rich, oily scent of unagi hitting hot charcoal had a way of cutting through rain, conversation, and self-control. For a city used to simple food, grilled eel felt dangerously close to indulgence, and that was exactly the point. Eel was not the cheapest thing you could eat in Edo, which only made its presence on the street more impressive. Vendors set up small grills near bridges, riverbanks, and busy crossings where foot traffic never stopped. Live eels were kept nearby, cleaned quickly and skewered with practiced efficiency. The meat sizzled as it hit the grill, fat dripping into the coals and sending up thick, mouth-watering smoke. People slowed. Coins appeared. The seasoning was simple but powerful. A glaze of soy sauce and sweetness brushed repeatedly onto the eel as it cooked, creating a dark, glossy surface that clung to the flesh. There were no plates, no ceremony. The skewer was handed over, still hot, and eaten standing in the open air. Fingers got sticky, sleeves were sacrificed, no one cared. Eel had a reputation beyond taste. It was considered strengthening, especially in the exhausting heat of summer. Edo summers were brutal, humid, crowded, and relentless. Eating eel was believed to restore energy, fortify the body, and keep you from collapsing in the streets. Whether or not it truly worked hardly mattered. People believed it did, and belief alone sold plenty of skewers. What made street eel remarkable was who ate it. Merchants grabbed skewers on their way home. Labourers splurged when they could. Travellers treated it as a small luxury after long days on the road. And samurai, again pretending not to notice they were doing the same thing as everyone else, stood just far enough away from the fire to maintain dignity while devouring every bite. Unlike soba, eel invited you to slow down. Just slightly. You stood longer. You chewed carefully. You savoured the fat and smoke and sweetness. For a few moments, the night market stopped being about speed and became about pleasure. In Edo, luxury did not always mean silver trays or private rooms. Sometimes it meant hot eel on a stick, eaten under a lantern while rain hissed on charcoal, and the city kept moving around you. Not every hunger in Edo's night markets came from an empty stomach. Some came from fatigue, cold, or simple habit. This was where sweets entered the scene. After the smoke and salt of noodles and eel, vendors selling dumplings and sweet treats offered something different: comfort, warmth, and a small moment of pleasure that didn't require much thinking. Dango vendors were easy to spot. Their stalls were quieter, their fires smaller, their smells softer. Rows of round rice dumplings were skewered neatly and held over gentle heat, brushed occasionally with sweet soy glaze or sprinkled with roasted soybean flour. The aroma was subtle but irresistible, especially in the rain. Sweet, warm, and faintly nutty, it pulled people in without shouting. Dango was food for everyone. Children tugged sleeves for it. Couples shared skewers. Older townspeople favoured it because it was easy to chew and gentle on the stomach. Unlike eel or noodles, dumplings didn't demand urgency. You could stand a little longer, chew slowly, and let the warmth spread without rushing back into the crowd. Other sweets followed the same logic. Steamed buns filled with sweet bean paste, simple rice cakes, and sugar-coated treats sold in small portions that fit easily in the hand. These were not elaborate confections. Sugar was expensive, and excess was frowned upon. But a little sweetness went a long way in a city where daily life was often harsh and repetitive. Sweets also carried social meaning. Offering someone a dumpling was a small kindness, a way to soften a long walk or a cold night. Travellers used them to pass time while waiting for ferries. Workers ate them as a reward after finishing late shifts. Even samurai, again quietly ignoring appearances, could be seen accepting a skewer with a nod before disappearing into the dark. Unlike other street foods, sweets didn't stain the hands with grease or fill the air with smoke. They felt cleaner, calmer, almost domestic. Eating them outside blurred the line between home and street, turning a public road into a brief resting place. In a city built on discipline and routine, these small sweet foods offered something rare: gentleness. Under lantern light and falling rain, a warm dumpling on a stick was enough to slow the night, even if only for a few bites. If soba was the backbone of Edo's night food and sweets its comfort, fish cakes were pure efficiency. These were foods designed to be eaten quickly, cleanly, and without stopping for long. Perfect for a city that never truly paused, even after dark. Kamaboko and other fish-based snacks appeared everywhere at night. Vendors worked near waterways, bridges, and ferry landings, where fresh fish was easiest to source and crowds naturally gathered. White fish was pounded into paste, shaped by hand, and cooked into firm cakes that could be sliced or skewered. Some were steamed, others lightly grilled, and a few were fried until the outside formed a thin crust. The smell was subtle but inviting. Less aggressive than eel, less comforting than sweets. Fish cakes sat somewhere in between. Salty, slightly sweet, and dense enough to quiet hunger, they were ideal for people who had places to be. One bite, then another, and the skewer was gone. No bowl to return, no chopsticks to wipe. Just food, eaten standing and forgotten as the night continued. Fried foods joined the mix as oil became more common in urban cooking. Small battered fish, tofu or vegetable pieces were dropped into hot fat and handed over still crackling. These stalls drew clusters of people, the sound of frying acting like a signal flare. The rain didn't matter. The cold didn't matter. Hot oil cut through everything. These foods attracted a particular crowd. Messengers, guards, boatmen and night workers favoured them because they could eat while moving. Samurai on patrol stopped briefly, ate in silence, and moved on. Travellers unfamiliar with the city trusted fish cakes because they were cooked thoroughly and unlikely to upset the stomach, an important consideration when inns were full and streets unfamiliar. Unlike soba vendors, fish cake sellers stayed put. Their stalls became landmarks. People remembered corners by what was sold there. Near the fish cake man by the bridge was as useful as any street name. Food mapped the city as much as buildings did. There was no glamour here. Fish cakes were practical, unpretentious, and reliable. They didn't promise luxury or comfort, just enough fuel to keep going. And in Edo, that was often all anyone asked of a meal. As lanterns flickered and footsteps passed endlessly by, these simple bites kept the night moving, one skewer at a time. Edo's night food was not just about what you ate, it was about how you ate it. There were no tables, no stools, and certainly no privacy. The street itself was the dining room, and everyone shared it whether they liked it or not. Eating meant standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, rain dripping from eaves, steam rising between faces that would never meet again. This way of eating shaped behaviour. You learned to balance a bowl in one hand and chopsticks in the other. You learned to angle your body so passing crowds didn't knock food into the mud. You learned to slurp quickly, chew efficiently, and step aside when finished. Lingering was rude, not because of manners, but because space was precious and hunger waited behind you. Night markets blurred social boundaries in ways daytime Edo rarely allowed. Rank still existed, of course, but it softened when everyone was equally wet, equally hungry, and equally impatient. A labourer and a samurai might stand beneath the same awning, eating the same soba from identical bowls. No conversation followed, no acknowledgement was required, but the shared moment existed all the same. There was an unspoken etiquette to it all. You didn't stare. You didn't comment on how someone ate. You didn't complain about the rain or the smoke. Everyone understood the conditions and accepted them. Street food demanded tolerance of noise, smells, crowds, and inconvenience. In return, it gave warmth and speed. Vendors became part of this rhythm. They watched hands and mouths more than faces, reading hunger through posture and impatience. A nod meant ready. A glance meant almost finished. When a customer stepped back, another stepped forward without ceremony. The transaction was brief but practiced, refined by repetition. Eating this way also changed the food itself. Portions were modest, flavours bold, textures forgiving. Nothing required cutting or careful handling. Everything assumed movement. The street dictated the menu, not the other way around. For travellers, this could be overwhelming at first. For locals, it was comfortingly familiar. The chaos was predictable. The mess was manageable. The rules were unwritten, but universally understood. In Edo, night food turned public space into something intimate without becoming personal. You shared heat, steam, and hunger with strangers, then moved on. And by morning, the street would forget you were ever there, except for the faint memory of smoke clinging to the wood. Edo's night markets didn't belong to any single class. They belonged to whoever was awake, hungry, and moving through the city after dark. That was their quiet power. In a society obsessed with rank, duty, and appearance, street food flattened distinctions without ever announcing that it was doing so. Commoners made up the bulk of the crowd. Labourers finishing late shifts. Artisans closing workshops. Porters heading home with aching shoulders. These were the people the night markets existed for. Their days were long, their homes small, and cooking after dark was often impractical or forbidden due to fire restrictions. Street food wasn't indulgence. It was dinner. Travellers depended on it even more. Edo was a destination city, constantly flooded with pilgrims, merchants, officials, and messengers. Inns filled quickly, and meals were not always guaranteed. A glowing lantern and a steaming pot offered reassurance. You didn't need to know the neighbourhood or the customs. Hunger worked the same everywhere. Then there were the samurai. Officially, they were expected to uphold dignity, restraint, and distance from common pleasures. Unofficially, they were human. Many lived on fixed stipends that didn't stretch far in a city as expensive as Edo. Street food was affordable, convenient, and discreet if eaten in the right corner of the night. A samurai standing beneath an awning with a bowl of soba was a study in controlled contradiction. Sword at the side, posture formal, chewing quickly and without comment. No one pointed it out. No one needed to. Everyone understood the arrangement. Appearances mattered, but hunger mattered more. Women were everywhere too, despite the dangers of night travel. Shopkeepers, vendors, travellers and workers moved in groups or stuck to well-lit routes. Street food stalls offered safety as well as nourishment. Light, noise, and people created pockets where one could pause without fear. Children appeared occasionally, sent on errands or tagging along with adults, clutching dumplings and trying not to spill them. Their presence reminded everyone that this wasn't a shadowy underworld. It was daily life continuing after sunset. Edo's night markets were democratic in the most practical sense. You didn't need permission, invitations, or connections. You needed coins and an appetite. For a few minutes at a stall, titles faded, and the only thing that mattered was whether the food was hot. In a city built on rigid order, that small freedom was quietly radical. Edo was a city obsessed with fire and terrified of it. Most buildings were wooden, streets were narrow, and a single spark could erase entire neighbourhoods. Laws regulating cooking, lighting, and open flames were strict, especially at night. And yet every evening, hundreds of charcoal fires flickered across the city. The night markets survived by mastering the art of not being noticed, or at least not being troublesome. Street food vendors learned to work within the rules without challenging them. Fires were kept small and controlled. Charcoal was favoured over open flame because it smoked less and burned more predictably. Stalls were positioned near water, bridges or wide crossings where officials were less nervous, and escape routes were easier if trouble appeared. Everything about the setup was designed for speed, including disappearance. Rain was both enemy and ally. It soaked clothes, dampened spirits, and turned streets into mud. But it also reduced fire risk. On wet nights, vendors appeared in greater numbers, knowing inspectors were less aggressive and customers more desperate for something hot. Lanterns glowed brighter in the rain, reflected in puddles like scattered stars. Officials did patrol, of course, but enforcement was inconsistent. As long as vendors didn't block traffic, cause fights, or spark fires, they were often tolerated. After all, officials ate too. Many knew exactly which stall to visit once their rounds were finished. Vendors adapted their menus to these realities. Foods that cooked quickly and cleanly survived. Anything requiring large flames, long preparation, or lingering smoke was avoided. This wasn't culinary tradition shaping food. It was bureaucracy. Stalls themselves were minimalist. No excess wood. No heavy structures. Everything could be packed up in moments. A shout, a glance, and the fire was covered, pot sealed, and the street returned to darkness as if nothing had happened. Rain sharpened the experience for everyone involved. Steam rose more dramatically. Smells carried further. Warm food felt more urgent. People huddled closer to stalls, creating temporary communities under shared eaves and umbrellas. The night markets thrived not because they defied the city's rules, but because they bent around them. Edo was rigid by day, flexible by night, and in that narrow space between law and necessity, street food endured. glowing softly, steaming patiently, and ready to vanish at a moment's notice. As the night wore on, the energy of Edo's street food slowly thinned. Crowds grew quieter, footsteps spaced out. The calls of vendors stretched farther between echoes. One by one, charcoal fires dimmed, pots were emptied, and lanterns were lowered. There was no closing bell, no announcement. The night markets ended the same way they began, gradually, almost politely. Vendors packed with the efficiency of people who had done this thousands of times. Bowls were wiped clean, skewers counted, coins tucked away. Shoulder poles were lifted once more, now lighter without their steaming cargo. Carts rolled towards storage sheds or narrow homes where families waited. By the time dawn approached, only faint scorch marks and the smell of damp charcoal hinted at what had been there hours earlier. For the city, this disappearance was essential. Streets had to return to their daytime roles, orderly, passable, and unmarked. Edo tolerated night food because it left no scars. It fed the city without claiming it. For those who ate, the meals lingered longer than the stalls. A bowl of soba taken under a bridge, a skewer of eel eaten in the rain, a dumpling shared while waiting for a ferry. These moments stitched themselves into memory. They were ordinary, repeatable, and deeply personal. Everyone had their favourite corner, their trusted vendor, their preferred time of night. The night markets shaped Edo's relationship with food in quiet ways. They normalised eating outside the home. They encouraged speed, simplicity, and bold flavour. They taught the city to value warmth over refinement, function over display. Even as restaurants grew more formal and cuisine more elaborate, the logic of street food remained underneath it all. Most importantly, the night markets belonged to no one and everyone at once. They weren't institutions, guilds, or traditions preserved in writing. They existed because people were hungry, space was limited, and fire was both feared and needed. When those conditions remained, so did the markets. By morning, Edo would look unchanged, busy, disciplined, and restrained. But beneath that surface lived the memory of steam, smoke, and shared hunger. And when night fell again, lanterns would rise, fires would glow, and the city would once more eat standing in the rain. A house in Roman Londinium did not welcome you with peace and quiet. The moment you crossed the threshold, the city came with you. Sound slipped through thin walls. Smoke clung to the ceiling. Somewhere nearby, someone was shouting, hammering, or arguing about money. This was not a countryside villa with colonnades and fountains. This was Rome, compressed, damp, and stubbornly alive in rainy Britain. Most Londinium houses were narrow and practical, shaped more by available space than comfort. Streets were crowded, land was valuable, and buildings rose close together. Many homes were long rectangles, opening directly onto the street. The front room often doubled as a shop or workspace, meaning privacy vanished the instant the door opened. If you lived here, your home was also part of the city's machinery. Light was scarce. Windows were small and often shuttered to keep out cold air and thieves. Instead, rooms relied on oil lamps, their soft yellow glow barely pushing back the gloom. These lamps burned olive oil shipped from far away, making light itself an imported luxury. The result was a constant haze. Soot blackened ceilings. Walls absorbed smoke. Your lungs noticed. The floors told a different story. Even in modest homes, Roman taste insisted on order and identity. Simple mosaic floors or tiled surfaces marked living spaces, separating civilized Roman life from the mud and rain outside. Shoes came off when possible. Dirt was swept away daily. This was Britain, but it would behave like Rome whether it liked it or not. Furniture was minimal. A few stools, a low table, storage chests pushed against the walls. Space mattered more than comfort. Rooms changed purpose throughout the day, sleeping at night, working by day, eating whenever food was available. Privacy was a concept you learned to live without. Smell was unavoidable. Cooking fires burned indoors. Oil lamps smoked. Nearby latrines and drains did not respect property lines. Add wet wool, damp wood, and the breath of too many people in too little space, and a Londinium house announced itself before you ever saw it. And yet, to its occupants, this was unmistakably Roman. The layout followed familiar rules. The decor copied Mediterranean styles. The daily routines, lighting lamps, sweeping floors, sharing space, reinforced identity. Outside, rain fell, and barbarians waited beyond the frontier. Inside, Rome endured, smoky and cramped, but defiantly at home. If light was scarce in a Londinium house, colour was not. Roman interiors relied on painted walls to transform cramped, dim spaces into something that felt deliberate, cultured, and Roman. Even far from Italy, even under constant cloud cover, people wanted their homes to look like they belonged to an empire that valued beauty as much as power. Walls were usually plastered and painted rather than left bare. Reds, yellows, whites, and deep earth tones dominated, arranged in panels meant to imitate stone blocks or marble slabs. This was visual illusion at work. Real marble was rare and expensive in Britain, but paint could pretend. A narrow room could feel grand if the walls suggested columns and polished stone, even if the reality was damp wood and brick beneath. These paintings were not purely decorative. They announced status. A well-painted wall told visitors that the homeowner had money, connections, or at least good taste. Even modest households invested in some decoration, often focusing on the most visible rooms. Back areas stayed plain. Front spaces performed. The British climate, however, was unforgiving. Moisture crept into plaster, causing cracks and flaking. Colours faded faster than they would have in the dry Mediterranean. Repairs were constant. Touch-ups were common. Owning a painted home in Londinium meant accepting that beauty required maintenance and patience. Motifs varied. Some walls featured simple geometric patterns. Others displayed vines, birds, or mythological figures copied from pattern books that circulated across the empire. These images connected Londinium to Rome, Pompeii, and countless other cities. You could stand in a rainy provincial house and look at the same gods and designs seen in warmer, wealthier places. Painted walls also served a practical role. They sealed plaster, reducing dust and making surfaces easier to clean. In a smoky house, this mattered. Soot wiped off painted surfaces more easily than raw plaster. Beauty and hygiene quietly worked together. At night, oil lamps brought these colours to life. Shadows flickered across painted panels, making flat designs seem to move. Rooms felt warmer, richer, more alive than daylight ever allowed. The illusion worked best after sunset. These walls did not hide the hardships of Londinium life, but they softened them. They reminded occupants that they were part of something vast and sophisticated. Outside, Britain was wet and cold. Inside, the walls said Rome had arrived and intended to stay. If the walls of a Londinium house declared Roman identity to the eye, the floors did so to the feet. Stepping inside, the change was immediate. Outside lay mud, puddles, and churned earth. Inside, order began at ground level. Mosaic floors were not everywhere, but they were common enough to matter. Wealthy homes featured intricate designs made from thousands of small stones, carefully arranged into patterns, borders, and images. More modest houses used simpler tile floors, still clean, flat, and deliberate. Either way, the message was clear. This space was Roman, and dirt was not welcome. Mosaics served practical purposes as much as decorative ones. They were durable, resistant to moisture, and easy to sweep. In a city where rain tracked in daily and smoke settled constantly, that mattered more than elegance. A mosaic could survive decades of boots, spilled food, and ash without complaint. Wooden floors, by contrast, rotted and warped. Stone endured. The designs themselves varied widely. Some showed geometric patterns, repeating shapes that created rhythm and balance. Others depicted animals, plants, or mythological scenes. These images were not chosen at random. They reflected taste, education, and aspiration. A homeowner might never visit Italy, but their floor could still display Mediterranean dolphins or gods they only knew through stories. Walking across these floors was a sensory experience. Bare feet in summer felt cool against stone. Sandaled steps echoed softly. Even in small, crowded houses, the floor created a sense of order and control beneath the chaos of daily life. Mosaics also guided movement. Borders marked transitions between spaces, cooking areas, sleeping zones, reception rooms. In homes with little in the way of walls, the floor quietly organized behavior. You didn't need signs. Your feet learned where to go. Maintenance was constant. Cracked tiles were replaced. Loose stones were reset. Neglect showed quickly, and a damaged floor reflected poorly on the household. A well-kept mosaic was a sign of discipline as much as wealth. At night, oil lamplight caught the pale stones and dark lines, making patterns shimmer slightly. Even in smoky air, the floor anchored the room. Above it, voices rose, fires burned, and rain drummed on the roof. Beneath it, Roman order remained solid, patient, and unmoved by Britain's weather. In Londinium, civilization quite literally began underfoot. No matter how carefully a Londinium house was decorated, smoke always won. Cooking fires, oil lamps, and braziers burned day and night, filling rooms with a haze that never truly cleared. Chimneys were rare, ventilation poor, and open flames were simply part of daily life. Living indoors meant breathing smoke. Cooking usually happened in a small hearth or brazier, sometimes in the same room where people slept and worked. Meals were prepared over charcoal or wood, both of which produced thick fumes. Windows helped when opened, but Britain's cold and rain made that uncomfortable for much of the year. More often, smoke rose slowly and settled along ceilings, staining plaster and darkening beams. Oil lamps added to the problem. They provided essential light, but burned constantly, especially during winter's long nights. Olive oil smoke was less harsh than wood smoke, but it lingered. Wicks needed trimming. Spilled oil left permanent stains. Every surface absorbed traces of combustion. The result was a smell you never quite escaped. Clothing carried it. Hair held it. Even clean homes smelled faintly of soot. Visitors noticed immediately, but residents stopped caring. Smoke became background, like rain or noise, unpleasant but unavoidable. Fire was both friend and threat. It cooked food, provided warmth, and made life indoors possible. It also terrified the city. Londinium, like other Roman towns, burned easily. Entire blocks could vanish in hours. For this reason, fire regulations existed, and households were expected to manage flames carefully. Braziers were small. Fires were watched constantly. Nighttime caution was drilled into habit. This fear shaped daily routines. Fires were extinguished before sleep whenever possible. Coals were banked carefully. Water was kept nearby. The sound of a neighbour's alarm could send everyone scrambling into the street. Despite the risk, warmth mattered. Britain was colder than Rome, and houses were poorly insulated. Without fire, rooms became damp and miserable. Smoke was the price paid for survival. Children grew up used to it. Eyes adjusted. Lungs adapted. Coughing was common but rarely questioned. Comfort was measured not by cleanliness of air, but by whether the fire stayed lit and the room stayed warm. In a Roman Londinium house, smoke was the invisible occupant, always present, rarely acknowledged, and absolutely essential. When daylight faded in Londinium, the house did not grow quiet. It grew smaller. Darkness pressed inward, shrinking rooms and corners until only pools of lamplight remained. Oil lamps were the heart of indoor life after sunset, and without them, the Roman household simply stopped functioning. These lamps were usually made of clay or bronze, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. A shallow bowl held olive oil, while a wick protruded from a narrow spout. Once lit, The flame was steady, but weak. One lamp illuminated only a small area, which meant most rooms relied on several, placed carefully to stretch light as far as possible. Olive oil did not come cheaply in Britain. It was imported, transported over long distances, and valued accordingly. As a result, light was used deliberately. Lamps were lit where people gathered, not where no one sat. Empty corners stayed dark. Hallways remained shadowy. You learned the layout of your home by memory as much as sight. Lamplight changed behaviour. People gathered close together in the evenings, not for intimacy, but practicality. Tasks requiring precision were done near the flame. Conversations happened in tight circles. Children played close to adults, and stories filled the dark spaces the light could not reach. Maintenance was constant. Wicks burned unevenly and needed trimming. Too long and they smoked badly, too short, and the flame flickered out. Oil had to be topped up carefully to avoid spills that soaked into floors and attracted dirt. A knocked-over lamp was dangerous. Fire and oil together could end a household in minutes. The quality of light mattered as well. Oil lamps produced a warm, yellow glow that softened harsh interiors. Painted walls looked richer at night. Mosaics shimmered faintly. Shadows danced across ceilings, giving still rooms a sense of movement. The illusion of comfort improved after dark, even as air grew thicker with smoke. Night routines adapted around light. Work slowed. Eating happened earlier. Sleep came sooner in winter when oil ran low. The household rose and rested according to flame as much as sun. In Londinium, light was not abundant or casual. It was controlled, rationed, and respected. When lamps were finally extinguished and darkness returned, the house did not feel empty. It felt paused, waiting for morning and the grey British daylight to take over once again. No matter how carefully a Londinium house was decorated, one fact could not be hidden. There was no private bathroom. Roman hygiene was communal, practical, and unapologetically public, even when it happened close to home. Most houses did not contain toilets at all. Instead, residents relied on shared latrines located down the street, beneath apartment blocks, or near public buildings. These were stone or wooden benches with openings carved along the top, positioned above flowing water or drainage channels. There were no partitions. Privacy was not expected. You sat beside whoever arrived at the same time and carried on as normal. For those living in larger houses or apartments, waste might drain into a cesspit or sewer channel connected to the street. This was convenient, but far from pleasant. Smells travelled easily. Blockages were common. Maintenance was a constant concern, and neglect quickly affected the entire building, not just one household. Water, when available, helped flush waste away, but Londinium's systems were less reliable than those of older Mediterranean cities. Heavy rain overwhelmed drains. Dry periods slowed flow. The result was inconsistency, sometimes efficient, sometimes foul. Cleaning practices reflected these limits. Water was used sparingly indoors. Full bathing happened at public bathhouses, not at home. Inside the house, washing meant basins, cloths, and cold water. Waste was removed, not hidden. Hygiene focused on management rather than elimination. Toilet paper did not exist. Instead, a shared sponge on a stick was rinsed between uses, a detail best not examined too closely. This was standard practice across the Roman world, and accepted without comment. Discomfort came not from the method itself, but from cold stone seats and damp air. Smell was unavoidable. Latrines were noisy, draughty, and rarely pleasant. Houses near them paid the price. Yet proximity also meant convenience, and in crowded Londinium, convenience mattered more than comfort. Despite modern assumptions, Roman sanitation was advanced for its time. Waste was directed away from living spaces, water flowed through drains, and public systems existed at all. But by modern standards, life was intimate, shared, and fragrant in ways that cannot be romanticized. In Londinium, civilization extended to waste management, but it did so collectively. Cleanliness was a shared responsibility, and privacy was a luxury few expected, let alone demanded. If smoke was the invisible presence inside a Londinium house, noise was the constant companion. Silence was rare. Walls were thin, floors carried sound, and houses pressed tightly against one another. Living indoors meant living with everyone else's life, whether you wanted to or not, or sounds arrived from all directions. From the street came carts rattling over stone, vendors shouting, boots splashing through puddles, and the endless hum of conversation. Workshops attached to houses added hammering, sawing, and grinding to the mix. Even after dark, Londinium did not fully sleep. Someone was always awake, working, arguing, or returning home late. Inside the house, noise travelled easily. Voices carried through doorways and stairwells. Footsteps echoed on tile and wood. A dropped pot sounded like an announcement. Privacy of sound simply did not exist. Families learned to speak over one another, to ignore what could not be changed, and to sleep through disturbances that would drive modern ears mad. Neighbours were part of daily life, whether you knew them or not. You heard their children cry, their meals being cooked, their arguments rising and falling through the walls. In apartments above shops, you smelled and heard business happening below from dawn to dusk. The boundary between households was thin, flexible, and frequently crossed by sound. This closeness shaped behaviour. People rose early because others did. Sleep schedules aligned by necessity. Disputes rarely stayed private, which discouraged extremes. Everyone knew when tensions were building. At the same time, gossip travelled fast. A loud argument or unusual visitor became neighbourhood knowledge by morning. Night amplified everything. With lamps lit and streets quieter, even small sounds carried farther. A neighbour coughing, a door opening, a fire being tended, all became part of the shared soundscape. Total darkness never arrived, and neither did total silence. Yet this noise created a sense of security. Silence often meant danger, fire, illness, or abandonment. Sound meant life continuing around you. You were not alone in the damp, smoky dark. Someone else was awake, breathing, moving. In Londinium, the house was not a retreat from the city. It was the city, folded inward. Noise passed freely, reminding everyone that Roman life in Britain was crowded, communal, and impossible to escape, but rarely lonely. When night finally settled over Londinium, the house did not transform into a place of rest so much as a place of rearrangement. Beds were not fixed features. Bedrooms, in the modern sense, barely existed. Sleep happened wherever space allowed. Most people slept on simple wooden frames or low platforms, topped with straw-filled mattresses or wool-stuffed pads. These absorbed damp easily and were aired whenever possible, though Britain's climate rarely cooperated. Blankets were heavy, practical, and often shared. Warmth mattered more than comfort. Rooms changed function as darkness fell. A space used for work or eating during the day became a sleeping area at night. Furniture was pushed aside. Lamps were moved. Families negotiated who slept where every evening, according to age, status, and necessity. Children slept together. Adults took the warmest spots, often closest to the dying fire. Privacy during sleep was minimal. Couples shared space with children, servants, or lodgers. In apartment buildings, entire families slept in single rooms. Sounds continued through the night. Coughing, snoring, footsteps from above, rain on roofs. Sleep was light, fragmented, and easily interrupted. Animals sometimes shared indoor space as well. Small dogs, kept for companionship or pest control, slept near hearths. Cats moved freely, hunting rodents drawn by food stores. Their presence was accepted, even welcomed. Fire was treated cautiously at night. Flames were reduced, not extinguished completely if warmth was needed. Coals glowed faintly. The risk of fire haunted every household, especially while sleeping. Many people learned to wake at the slightest unfamiliar sound or smell. Dreams mixed with reality in smoky air and flickering shadows. Oil lamps cast moving shapes on walls until they were finally snuffed out. Darkness returned gradually, never completely. Moonlight slipped through shutters. Street lamps and passing torches leaked faint glows inside. Morning came early. Light returned slowly through clouds, and the house shifted again. Bedding was rolled up. Mats were stacked. Space was reclaimed for work and movement. In Londinium, sleep was not escape. It was another shared activity, shaped by crowding, climate, and caution. The Roman night was not silent or private. It was simply darker, closer, and briefly still. By morning, a Londinium house looked ordinary again. Damp floors, smoky air, and the muted grey light of Britain pressing through shutters. Yet everything about the space, from the painted walls to the worn mosaic underfoot, carried a deliberate message. This was Rome, even here, even under clouds. Living in such a house required constant compromise. Roman ideals of order, beauty, and comfort collided daily with cold weather, cramped streets, and limited resources. Olive oil was precious. Light was rationed. Space was shared. Privacy was rare. And yet, people continued to build, decorate, and organize their homes according to Roman customs rather than local ones. That persistence mattered. A Londinium house was not just shelter. It was a statement of identity. To live like a Roman was to participate in the empire, regardless of geography. Cooking with Roman tools, sleeping in Roman layouts, walking across Roman floors reinforced belonging in ways laws and coins alone could not. The house also served as a bridge between cultures. Local Britons adopted Roman styles, while Roman settlers adapted to British conditions. The result was not a perfect copy of Italy, but something sturdier. Walls were thicker, fires burned longer, routines shifted earlier to match the climate. Rome bent without breaking. Archaeology reveals this quiet resilience. The fragments we find, broken lamps, chipped mosaics, soot-stained plaster, tell stories of ordinary lives rather than grand monuments. They show how empire functioned at the level of meals, sleep, and shared space. A Londinium house did not protect its occupants from rain, noise, or smoke very well. What it did offer was familiarity. In a distant province, familiarity was power. It made foreign land feel navigable, survivable, and eventually, home. When residents stepped outside into muddy streets and grey skies, they carried that identity with them. And when they returned at night, lighting lamps and tending fires, they recreated Rome once more within wooden walls. In the end, Roman Londinium was not defined by its forum or its roads alone, but by thousands of small, smoky houses where people lived, adapted and insisted, quietly and daily, that Rome belonged here too. Boudicca was born into a society where childhood was not sheltered, softened, or delayed. Among the Iceni of eastern Britain, life began outdoors, surrounded by cattle, open fields, and people who measured wealth in animals rather than coins. A child did not grow up apart from adult life. She grew directly into it. The Iceni lived in scattered farmsteads rather than dense towns. Roundhouses clustered loosely, built of wood, wattle, and thatch, their interiors smoky and shared. From infancy, Boudicca would have known the rhythm of communal living, voices overlapping, animals close by, fires always burning. Privacy was rare, belonging was constant. Her family's status mattered. The Iceni were not poor, and her household likely owned cattle, the true currency of the tribe. Herds defined power, security, and marriage prospects. Children learned early to recognize animals, protect them, and understand their value. Wealth was not abstract. It could wander off, fall sick, or be stolen. From a young age, Boudicca would have been taught where she came from. Oral history mattered deeply among the Iceni. Elders recited lineages, past victories, old wrongs, and ancestral lands. These stories were not entertainment. They were instruction. They explained who belonged where, who owed loyalty to whom, and why outsiders were treated with suspicion. Women were not hidden from this knowledge. Iceni culture allowed women a visible role in property, ritual, and authority. Girls listened to the same stories as boys. They learned the same tribal pride. The idea that leadership might one day rest in female hands was not unthinkable. It already existed in memory. Roman presence hovered at the edges of this world. During Boudicca's early childhood, Rome was not yet fully in control, but its influence was growing. Traders passed through. Rumours followed. Shiny goods, foreign coins, and unfamiliar laws began to appear. For Iceni families, this created tension, curiosity mixed with unease. As a child, Boudicca would not have understood politics, but she would have felt pressure. Adults spoke carefully. Elders watched roads more closely. Stories of the past grew sharper, more defensive. Identity mattered more when it felt threatened. Her childhood was not gentle, but it was grounding. She grew up knowing land, kin, and story before empire, before rebellion, before war. Long before she became a symbol, she was simply an Iceni girl, raised to remember who she was and to never forget where she belonged. For an Iceni child, education did not happen in a separate place or at a set time. It happened everywhere, all at once. Boudicca learned by watching, copying, and doing, long before anyone thought to call it teaching. From early childhood, she would have been drawn into daily work. Not forced, but expected. Children followed adults into fields and pastures, absorbing routines through repetition. They learned how to walk among cattle without spooking them, how to recognize illness in an animal's posture, how to respect fences and boundaries that protected tribal wealth. Mistakes were corrected immediately, sometimes sharply. Survival allowed little room for indulgence. Girls learned the same foundational skills as boys. Herding, food preparation, and basic tool use were not gendered at a young age. Strength mattered, but so did awareness. Carrying water, gathering firewood, and tending fires trained endurance and discipline. Cold, rain, and mud were constant companions. Complaints changed nothing. The land itself was a teacher. Children learned which fields flooded, which paths stayed firm after rain, and which woods offered shelter or danger. These were not abstract lessons. Getting it wrong meant wet feet, lost animals, or worse. Boudicca would have learned to read landscape the way others learned letters. Hunting and weapon familiarity began early, even for girls. While not every child became a warrior, everyone understood tools of defense. Slings, short spears, and shields were present in daily life, not locked away. Watching older warriors train left impressions. Movement, balance, and confidence were learned informally, through imitation and play that edged into seriousness. Mothers played a central role in this education. Iceni women were not passive caretakers. They managed resources, negotiated within kin networks, and passed on practical knowledge. A girl learned not just how to survive, but how to stand her ground, physically and socially. Roman influence crept into these lessons as well. Imported goods appeared in households. New tools and ornaments sparked curiosity. Adults discussed changing trade patterns and shifting power. Children listened, even when they pretended not to. By the time Boudicca reached adolescence, her education was already complete in its essentials. She knew her land, her people, and her responsibilities. No classroom could have offered more. What remained was not learning how to live, but learning how to respond when that life came under threat. As Boudicca grew, words shaped her as much as labour did. Among the Iceni, history was not written. It was spoken, remembered, and repeated until it became part of the listener. Evenings around the fire were classrooms of a different kind, where memory was trained and identity reinforced. Elders held authority not because of age alone, but because they remembered. They carried stories of ancestors, migrations, alliances, and betrayals. These accounts were recited carefully, often with ritual precision. Names mattered, places mattered. Forgetting was dangerous, because forgetting meant losing claim to land or honour. Boudicca would have learned these stories early. She listened as adults named rivers and hills and explained why they mattered. Certain places were tied to victories or losses. Others marked burial grounds or sacred spaces. Knowing this geography of memory was part of belonging. A child who knew the stories knew where she stood. These oral traditions also defined enemies. Rome, at first, appeared as a distant force, powerful, strange, and not entirely hostile. Stories described other tribes who had resisted or cooperated with outsiders. The lessons were never simple. Pride was praised, but recklessness was warned against. Strength had to be paired with judgment. Women featured prominently in these narratives. Iceni history did not erase them. Stories included warrior women, wise negotiators, and fierce protectors of kin. This mattered. Boudicca did not grow up hearing that power was reserved for men alone. She grew up hearing that leadership could take many forms, and that courage was not limited by sex. Ritual reinforced memory. Seasonal gatherings, feasts, and ceremonies repeated the same stories year after year. Children learned when to be silent, when to respond, and when to watch closely. Participation mattered more than performance. These moments bound individuals to the group. Roman pressure intensified the importance of these traditions. As Roman laws, taxes, and military presence expanded, Iceni elders repeated their stories with sharper emphasis. Identity had to be defended verbally before it could be defended physically. Boudicca absorbed all of this. She learned who her people were, not through instruction, but through immersion. The past was not distant. It lived in voices, gestures, and ritual. By the time she reached maturity, the stories were no longer lessons. They were part of her thinking. When later events demanded action, Boudicca would not need to search for motivation. It had been spoken into her since childhood. Among the Iceni, womanhood was not defined by silence or seclusion. Boudicca grew up watching women who worked, argued, negotiated, and endured. Strength was visible and expected. Girls learned early that survival required more than obedience, it required resolve. Mothers were central figures in Iceni life. They managed households, oversaw food stores, and protected family interests when men were away. Their authority was practical rather than symbolic. A mother's decisions shaped daily survival, and children learned quickly whose voice carried weight inside the home. Physical strength was not discouraged. Girls worked alongside adults, lifting, carrying, and enduring the same weather. Bodies were trained by necessity, not ideology. A capable woman was valuable to her family and respected by her community. Frailty was not romanticized. Women also played key roles in ritual and council. They attended gatherings, participated in ceremonies, and spoke in discussions that affected kin groups. This visibility mattered. Boudicca would have seen women disagree openly, persuade others, and defend their positions. Authority was not theoretical, it was practiced. Stories reinforced this reality. Tribal memory included women who had led migrations, defended settlements, or guided decisions during crisis. These stories were not presented as exceptions. They were presented as part of how things worked. Leadership was situational, earned through action rather than restricted by sex. Roman culture stood in contrast. As Roman influence grew, Iceni women encountered new expectations. Different dress, different customs, different limits. Roman women of status were often more confined, their power quieter and indirect. These differences did not go unnoticed. For Iceni girls, this contrast sharpened identity. What outsiders considered improper or unfeminine, the Iceni considered practical and honourable. Pride formed in opposition as much as tradition. Boudicca's understanding of womanhood was shaped by these examples. She learned that strength could be visible, voice could be raised, and authority could be claimed when circumstances demanded it. Submission was not the default setting. This upbringing did not promise leadership, but it made it imaginable. When later events pushed Boudicca into a public role, she did not step into unknown territory. She stepped into a tradition she had watched all her life, one where women stood firm, spoke clearly, and acted when survival required it. In Boudicca's childhood, wealth did not shine or jingle. It breathed, moved, and grazed. Among the Iceni, cattle were the measure of prosperity, stability, and influence. A household's standing could be counted in animals rather than objects, and children learned this reality early. Cattle were more than food. They provided milk, leather, traction, and trade value. They could be gifted to seal alliances, exchanged to settle disputes, or displayed to signal status. Losing cattle meant more than hunger. It meant vulnerability. Protecting them was a communal priority, and children grew up knowing which animals belonged to which family and why that mattered. Boudicca would have learned these distinctions by watching adults negotiate. Discussions about herds were serious and often tense. Boundaries were guarded. Theft was remembered. Promises involving cattle were binding in ways that words alone were not. This system shaped ideas of power. Leadership was not abstract authority. It was the ability to protect resources, distribute them wisely, and defend the group's wealth. A leader who failed at this lost support quickly. Children absorbed this lesson without being taught explicitly. Roman money entered this world awkwardly. Coins appeared, shiny, portable, and unfamiliar. To Roman officials, money meant control. To the Iceni, it was confusing and less trustworthy than living wealth. You could not milk a coin. You could not watch it grow. Its value depended on foreign systems. Adults debated this difference openly. Children listened. Boudicca would have heard arguments about trade, tribute, and obligation. She would have seen suspicion harden around Roman demands that reduced wealth to numbers rather than herds. Cattle also shaped marriage and inheritance. Alliances were built around them. Women were not excluded from this system. Iceni women could own property, including animals, and exercise control over resources. This mattered deeply. Power was not monopolized by men. For a young Boudicca, this meant understanding that strength was tied to stewardship. Power came from responsibility, not domination. Losing resources weakened a leader. Protecting them built loyalty. As Roman pressure increased, cattle became symbolic as well as practical. They represented independence, continuity, and resistance to outside control. When Romans interfered with Iceni wealth, they interfered with identity. Boudicca's childhood understanding of power was shaped here. Among animals, agreements, and watchful eyes. Long before she confronted empire, she learned that authority came from safeguarding what sustained her people. As Boudicca moved toward adolescence, Rome was no longer a distant rumour. It became a presence, visible, audible, and increasingly unavoidable. Roads cut through landscapes that once belonged solely to the tribes. Forts appeared where forests had stood. Roman soldiers passed through Iceni territory with an ease that unsettled everyone who watched them. For a child, this pressure was felt before it was understood. Adults spoke differently when Romans were nearby. Conversations lowered. Decisions took longer. Hospitality became cautious rather than open. Boudicca would have sensed the shift immediately. The world felt tighter, watched. Roman goods continued to circulate. Pottery, metalwork, wine vessels, and some Iceni welcomed them. Trade brought advantages. Alliances offered temporary security. Others saw danger. Each object from Rome carried expectations: obedience, tribute, acceptance of foreign authority. Nothing came freely. Children absorbed these tensions in fragments. A Roman soldier laughing near a market, an elder scowling as taxes were discussed, a parent warning against wandering too far from home. Rome did not need to strike to be felt. Its presence alone reshaped behaviour. The Iceni were officially a client kingdom during Boudicca's youth, allowed to govern themselves under Roman oversight. On the surface, this meant peace. In practice, it meant uncertainty. Rules could change without warning. Roman officials replaced tribal customs with legal demands that ignored local traditions. For a young Boudicca, this was formative. She grew up knowing that authority could arrive uninvited, speak confidently, and expect compliance. She learned that resistance did not always take the form of battle. Sometimes it took the form of stubborn adherence to old ways. Roman attitudes toward women were also visible. Female authority among the Iceni confused and unsettled Roman observers. This contrast sharpened cultural boundaries. What Rome dismissed as improper, the Iceni defended as tradition. Pressure created clarity. Identity became more important precisely because it was challenged. Language, dress, ritual, and memory hardened into markers of belonging. Boudicca's generation did not inherit a relaxed culture. They inherited one under stress. By the time she reached adulthood, Rome was no longer just a force at the edge of her world. It was inside it, shaping choices and threatening autonomy. Boudicca's childhood did not produce rebellion, but it prepared the ground for it. As Boudicca entered adolescence, childhood ended without ceremony. There was no clear line between girlhood and adulthood, only increasing expectation. Strength, awareness, and self-control were no longer practiced in preparation. They were required. Adolescence among the Iceni was a period of observation as much as action. Young people were expected to watch how authority worked before claiming any of it themselves. Boudicca would have paid close attention to gatherings where disputes were settled, alliances discussed, and Roman demands interpreted. She listened more than she spoke, learning who commanded respect and why. Reputation mattered deeply. A young woman's standing was shaped by reliability, composure, and kin loyalty. Loudness without purpose damaged credibility. Courage without judgment invited danger. Boudicca learned to balance presence with restraint, a skill that would later define her leadership. Training continued informally. Physical endurance remained essential. Carrying loads, riding horses, and long hours outdoors were routine. Iceni women did not withdraw from these tasks as they aged. Strength remained part of identity. Adolescence was about refinement, not replacement. Marriage prospects entered the conversation during this period, not as romance, but as politics. Alliances were discussed openly. A young woman's lineage, character, and family resources mattered. Boudicca would have been aware that her future carried weight beyond herself. Marriage was not submission. It was strategy. Roman involvement made these decisions heavier. Aligning with the wrong people could invite scrutiny or punishment. Aligning too closely with Rome could fracture tribal support. Adolescents grew up fast in this environment. Choices carried consequences that reached beyond the household. Boudicca also learned the power of presence. Tall, confident, and composed, she would have stood out in gatherings. Physical stature mattered in a culture that valued visible strength. But presence alone was not enough. Authority had to be justified repeatedly through action and judgment. Watching Roman officials interact with Iceni leaders sharpened her understanding of dominance. Rome spoke with certainty. It expected compliance. Yet it relied on local leaders to enforce its will. This contradiction did not go unnoticed. Power, she learned, was not always as solid as it appeared. By the end of adolescence, Boudicca was no longer merely absorbing her world. She was evaluating it. Childhood had given her identity. Adolescence gave her clarity. What remained was the moment when observation would turn into action. By the time Boudicca reached adulthood, her life was no longer shaped only by kin and land. Marriage entered as both obligation and opportunity. Among the Iceni, marriage was not a private affair. It was a political instrument, binding families, redistributing wealth, and strengthening alliances in an increasingly unstable world. Boudicca's marriage to Prasutagus, a man of status within the Iceni, reflected this reality. He was not a romantic choice, but a strategic one, a partner whose position could protect the tribe under growing Roman pressure. Through this union, Boudicca's personal authority expanded alongside her responsibilities. Marriage did not silence her. Iceni custom allowed women to retain influence within their households and beyond. Boudicca did not become invisible. She became more visible, now standing beside a leader rather than observing from the edges. Her voice carried more weight because it was backed by lineage, reputation, and alliance. Children followed, deepening her stake in the future. Motherhood sharpened rather than softened her understanding of power. What had once been theoretical, the defense of land, identity, and autonomy, became immediate. Roman interference now threatened not just tradition, but her daughter's inheritance. Rome's presence continued to tighten. Client kingship offered a fragile peace, dependent on Roman approval. Laws increasingly favoured Roman creditors and officials. Iceni autonomy narrowed with each agreement signed under pressure. Boudicca watched these concessions accumulate. Domestic life reflected this tension. Roman goods filled homes even as Roman authority strained relationships. Wealth existed alongside vulnerability. Security depended on Roman tolerance rather than tribal strength alone. This imbalance was dangerous, and Boudicca knew it. Marriage placed her closer to decision-making, but it also revealed its limits. Rome allowed local leaders power only as long as they remained useful. Respect was conditional. Autonomy was temporary. For Boudicca, the world narrowed. Childhood freedom gave way to responsibility. Choices carried greater risk. Every Roman demand tested patience. Every compromise chipped away at identity. This stage of life did not yet produce open resistance. It produced awareness. Boudicca learned how fragile power could be when granted rather than claimed. The ground beneath her feet was no longer secure, and she could feel it shifting. By the time Boudicca's childhood truly ended, the world she had grown up in no longer existed in the same form. The Iceni land remained, the cattle still grazed, the stories were still told. But the balance had shifted. Rome was no longer at the edges. It stood over everything. Nothing in Boudicca's early life had been gentle or insulated, and that was precisely what shaped her. She had grown up working the land, hearing the stories, watching women lead, and learning that power came from responsibility rather than permission. She understood wealth as something living and vulnerable, not abstract and distant. She had watched Roman authority press inward, testing the limits of Iceni independence one demand at a time. Her childhood did not teach her rebellion directly. It taught her identity. It taught her endurance. It taught her where authority truly came from, the trust of her people and the defense of what sustained them. When Rome eventually crossed lines that could not be negotiated away, Boudicca did not need to invent resistance. She recognized it as necessary. Every lesson of her youth pointed toward that moment. The oral histories that emphasized honor and memory, the mothers who modeled strength and resolve, the cattle that symbolized autonomy, the Roman pressure that made compromise feel like erosion rather than peace. Boudicca's later rebellion was not sudden or emotional in the way Roman writers portrayed it. It was rooted. It grew from a childhood spent watching power operate, fairly and unfairly, and understanding the difference. When her world finally broke, it did so along fault lines that had existed since her youth. Rome may have believed it was shaping a compliant province. Instead, it was shaping someone who knew exactly what was being taken away. Before the war cries, before the flames and the speeches, there was a girl raised among the Iceni, and that upbringing made everything that followed not only possible, but inevitable.